Hi, everybody. I'm Carol Becker, Dean of the School of the Arts. Thank you for coming. This is, I would like to thank our co-sponsors tonight, because we have several. We like to work across the university as much as we can, the School of the Arts, and people like to partner with us. So tonight we're co-sponsoring this event with the American African Diaspora Studies Department, which is called at Columbia AAADS, the Barnard Center for Research on Women, the Center for Justice, the Departments of History at Columbia and at Barnard, and the Institute for Research in African American Studies. So we're happy to be partnering with all these parts of the university. I want to acknowledge there are some special guests. I'm not asking anybody to stand up. I'm just acknowledging that they're here. But there are special guests in the audience, and they were integral to this project in so many ways. David Gilbert is here. Jennifer Dorn is here. Ty Jones is here, Columbia Professor of History and historical consultant to the podcast. Zayd's family is here. Jamal's family is here. So special welcome to all of you. Really thrilled. We have the next generations. So I'm really so happy to be doing this event tonight with Zayd Ayers Dohrn and Jamal Joseph. And as you know, we're here to discuss Zayd's award-winning podcast, Mother Country Radicals, A Family History of the Weather Underground. It's all there in the title. And to contemplate together what is to be gleaned from these historical and personal stories that might help us think about our complex and very urgent worldly situations today and our response to them. I was so taken with the podcast when I first heard it, and was Jack and I driving from Michigan to New York, and just completely enraptured with it, that I knew that we had to bring Zayd and talk about it in our series To Transform. It is a brilliant mix of the personal and the political, an important record of that historical moment of the 60s and 70s, the Weather Underground, the Black Panther Party, the war in Vietnam, and the battle at home waged against that war, told from a completely unique perspective. And I also found the podcast profound in attempting to deal with the effects of the decisions and actions of one generation on the next, told brilliantly by Zayd with serious reflection, honesty, and a lot of love. So let me start by introducing Zayd Ayers Dohrn and Jamal Joseph, and after my introductions, I'm going to hand the podium over to Zayd to talk about the making of the podcast, play us some clips, and after which I'm going to return with Jamal, and we're going to have a conversation, and then, because we have such an amazing audience, I'm hoping you'll ask lots of questions. So, Zayd Ayers Dohrn is the creator and the host of the podcast Mother Country Radicals, which has already won several awards, including the Tribeca Film Festival Award in Audio Storytelling. He's a brilliant storyteller, a writer, and a playwright working in multiple forms. His plays include The Profane, Want, Reborning, Muckrackers, Long Way, Go Down, and others, and these have received much praise and critical recognition. He's the recipient of the Horton Foote New American Play Prize, the Kennedy Center's Gene Kennedy Smith Award, the Theater Masters Visionary Playwright Award, and a two-time recipient of Lincoln Center's Lecomte de Nuit Prize. He is currently writing films for Netflix and Film Nation while developing a television series, and when he's not doing all that, he's a professor at Northwestern University and also director of the MFA in writing for the screen and the stage. His mother, as you know, is Bernadine Dohrn. She was once referred to as the most dangerous woman in America. His father is Bill Ayers, and both his parents were radicals and counterculture outlaws, part of the Weather Undergrounds, on the run from the FBI. And as he himself has described his parents, quote, they brawled with riot cops on the streets of Chicago, bombed the Pentagon and the U.S. Capitol, broke comrades out of prison, and teamed up with black militant groups to rob banks, fight racism, and help build a revolution. He has said, quote, I don't have the political certainty of my parents. I really love that word, certainty, in relation to political thinking, which is why I'm a writer and not an activist. But I'm interested in the messy tangle of personal and political forces that motivate people to risk their lives and families to try to change the world. And Mother Country Radicals brilliantly engages this intriguing mix and profound mix and complexity. Jamal Joseph is my esteemed colleague at Columbia. He is professor of professional practice in film and former chair of the film program at Columbia University School of the Arts. And he's written, directed, and produced many films and documentaries. He also has written a biography of the famous rapper, his godson, Tupac Shakur, who was killed in a drive-by homicide in 1996. His memoir, Panther Baby, is about his time as the youngest spokesperson and leader of the Black Panther New York chapter, and for his association and work with the Panthers and the Black Liberation Army, he was sentenced to 12 years in Leavenworth, U.S. Penitentiary. But as he has said, he credits the combined 9 years he actually spent in the Black Panther Party and in state and federal prisons as, quote, the fire that forged his creative sword. In Leavenworth Penitentiary, he earned 2 college degrees from the University of Kansas, wrote poetry, a first play, directed theatrical productions, and when he was released, he helped found the now much acclaimed youth performance company, Impact Repertory Theater. Working and leading Impact has affected almost 5,000 Harlem youth who have been encouraged to learn and practice art for social change. And in 2008, he was nominated for an Academy Award in the Best Song category for his contributions to the song Raise It Up, performed by Impact Repertory Theater in the 2007 film August Rush. And that's just about when I met you, right around then. Jamal has been the recipient of many awards, including a Cine Golden Eagle, a Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame Award, an NAACP Leadership Award, and more. And his films, Chapter and Verse, won the Pan-African Film Festival Audience Choice Award and was a New York Times critic pick. And Jamal's writing and directing credits include Drive-By, DAZN, Hard Chorus, Hip Hop on the Promised Land, and Hugh's Dream Harlem. His screenplay credits include Knights of the South Bronx and Ali, an American Hero. Jamal always says that when he attended his first Panther meeting in Brooklyn, he expected to leave with a gun. Instead, he was handed what was called the secret weapon of the revolution, a stack of books, including the autobiography of Malcolm X and quotations of Chairman Mao Zedong. He has been writing, studying, producing, directing, and organizing ever since. And I'm now going to turn this over to Zayd, and then we'll all have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Whoop, let me do this. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Dean Carol Becker for organizing this event, for that lovely introduction. I want to start by thanking, well, Carol mentioned Ty Jones is in the audience, also Ariana Garib-Lee. Along with Stephanie Cohen, our producer, these two were probably the most integral and closest collaborators in making this series. You probably know that this kind of show is a collaborative effort, and Ty and Ariana were with me the entire time. Also want to thank Jamal Joseph for organizing this event and for being such a legendary presence in the series. Those of you who have listened to it know he's not only integral to the story I was telling, but steals every scene that he was in. It's really great to be back at Columbia. I kind of grew up here, and actually the place where we lived, my family lived when we were underground, is right over here on 123rd Street in Amsterdam. When my mom went to jail, my dad enrolled at Teachers College, and then many years later, I came back here and studied in the PhD program in English and Comparative Literature for 5 years until I dropped out. So it's a big part of my life. Our daughters were born here. Columbia's campus was literally my childhood playground, so it feels like a homecoming. I want to say, I don't want to take too long with the intro. I'm eager to have a conversation with all of you, with Carol and Jamal, and they've asked me to say just a few words, play a couple short clips from the series to kind of set the scene for those of you who don't know the story. So I'm going to start with a 90-second clip. I'm going to play 4 total clips. Each one is under 2 minutes. This is just the beginning of the trailer to kind of set the scene for the story that we were going to tell. In 1970, a 28-year-old recent law school graduate became the most wanted woman in America.
Angela Davis was replaced on the FBI's 10 most wanted list this afternoon by Bernardine Ray Dohrn, described as an underground leader of the Weathermen.
They said she was an enemy of the state.
Within the next 14 days, we will attack a symbol or institution of American injustice.
A homegrown terrorist.
A bomb exploded early this morning in the Pentagon.
J. Edgar Hoover called her the most dangerous woman in America.
I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war.
She's also my mother. What's it like having me do this kind of research into your past?
It's wonderful that you're interested even, but it scares me.
I'm Zayd Ayers Dohrn, host of the new podcast, Mother Country Radicals, and I was born underground. When I was growing up, my parents were on the run from the FBI, at war with the U.S. government.
Maybe they had the ability to assassinate the president. Maybe they could blow up Congress and kill congressmen, important congressmen.
Last night we destroyed the pig again. This time it begins a fall offensive.
That was a powerful idea, that there were these white people who really wanted to support the Black liberation movement.
It was hard for me to understand as a kid why my parents and their friends were willing to risk their lives, even their children, to try to change this country.
I was determined to not have being a mother stop me from also being a revolutionary.
Yeah, it's very strange for me to sit here listening to my own voice, but thank you for bearing with me. So you can probably hear from that clip that a lot of what the show is about is, as Carol said, the relationship between the personal and the political. Kind of sacrifices people make for what they believe in activism, in art, in revolution, and in their families, for their families, and sometimes at the expense of their families. We started conducting these interviews, Ariana and Ty and I, in the midst of the pandemic. And so it was a time when we were all separated from each other, separated from our families. We couldn't talk to anybody except over Zoom. And so a lot of the personal motivation for making the series for me was really to preserve the voices of people I loved and cared about. My mom was about to turn 80. We started the show when she was 79. Kathy Boudin, who some of you know is kind of an adopted mom to me, had stage 4 cancer. She was very ill. And I really didn't know when I would see them again, or how I might be able to remember them if I didn't get to see them again. As it turned out, Kathy passed away while we were working on the series, just a couple days before it came out. So having her voice, having my mom's voice, having the voices of these kind of elders of our family felt important personally to preserve those. But then there was also this much bigger political motivation. Besides being my friends and family members, I realized, these people, Jamal and Jeff Jones, Kathy, David, Bernardine, and Bill, are really historical figures. And it's hard to kind of fathom that when you're a kid growing up with your parents. But these are people who walked alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and worked with Fred Hampton and broke Timothy Leary out of jail. And they knew Abby Hoffman and Eldridge Cleaver and Huey P. Newton and Assata Shakur and on and on. They allegedly knew Barack Obama, right? So it seemed important to me in some larger sense to preserve those stories, not just for my family, but for future generations in some bigger sense. But even more than preservation, I got very interested in the idea of what we could learn from these people, what we could learn from their stories. During the Trump era, like probably many of you, I was thinking a lot about resistance, what we might be called upon to do in our own time, like after Lafayette Square and after January 6th. It felt like the country might be descending into some sort of real authoritarianism. And even now, right, most of us are probably looking around thinking, how bad could it get? What could we do? How might we resist sort of racist law and order nationalism, white Christian nationalism, which is on the rise in this country? How do we fight back against that? But then talking to folks like Jamal, maybe especially Jamal, it became clearer and clearer to me that many people in this country have been resisting exactly that for a very long time, maybe longer than some of us were able to see or able to admit. All the way back to slavery, of course, and Jim Crow, but up through the militarized police occupation of black neighborhoods today. I want to give just one example. So I don't know how many of you know the name Clifford Glover. If you've listened to the series, you might remember. For those of you who don't know, Clifford was a 10-year-old boy. He was shot in the back by a plainclothes police officer in Queens, New York in 1973. Cops said Clifford had a gun. Turned out it was either a candy bar or a little toy wrench that he carried around to help in the family junkyard. No gun was ever found. And he was killed by this cop. I think you'll hear, I'm going to play a clip. I think you'll hear in this next clip why it felt to me so resonant for today, why I thought we needed to pay attention to this story now. You can still hear the frustration in Sekou's voice 50 years later.
And they murdered the kid, and then they find that there was nothing wrong with that, and no one's held responsible for that. So the Army held them responsible.
The Army held them responsible. In other words,
things like this would happen, and there would be a BLA response to that. And that response was, yes, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You cannot just wantonly come in and murder people in the community without a military political consequence.
In the 3 years leading up to Clifford Glover's death, 60% of people killed by New York police had been black, at a time when black people made up only 20% of the city's population. The numbers in other major cities, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Detroit, are even worse. Hundreds of black people killed every year, with little attention and no accountability. To the BLA, it feels like the police have already gone to war with the black community.
They were the occupying army. They were the ones that were murdering black men, women, and children.
And the BLA decides to fight back.
People were in such a rage by what had happened, by people being killed on the streets, by the blatant fascism, by what was going on, that I think that people were like, let me get some licks in before I die.
Okay, so this is maybe a coincidence of timing, the kind of thing that works, just sometimes happens when you're making something. But I think Jamal told me that story the same month that George Floyd was killed. In any case, it was right around that time. And so here I found myself talking to these revolutionaries from the Black Liberation Army, from the Weather Underground, and believe it or not, they are all telling me, independently of one another, that what had initially radicalized them was police violence against black people, police killing black people. So the murder of Fred Hampton by Chicago cops, killing of Clifford Glover in Queens, all these incidents were the exact things that had set these people on a path from peace activists to militants to committed revolutionaries. And it really did feel like we were living through a parallel moment today. And I was thinking a lot about what are we going to do? How are we going to respond? So the series is partly about how people can be radicalized. And I mean radicalized not just in terms of the turn towards violence, but in terms of seeing something that they hadn't seen before, right? Seeing the roots of things, seeing systemic racism and injustice. It's also about the very complicated and fraught, but I think important relationship between the black and white undergrounds of the time. It's kind of an untold story of how these groups supported one another, learned from each other while they were on the run and fighting the police and the FBI. So what we now call allyship, right? Or a lot of these revolutionaries call comradeship. And maybe Jamal can talk later about the difference between those two ideas. But for now, I'm going to let my mom articulate her very particular idea about solidarity.
And it was complicated.
Oh, wait, I got to set a little scene first. This is the 1969 SDS convention. So there was a lot of debate going on at the time within SDS about the future of the white peace movement, right? These were mostly anti-war activists, white anti-war activists. My mom was one of the three national leaders of SDS. But the debate that was going on at the time really boiled down to some people thinking this is a class struggle. It's not about race, it's about class, and we should go into the factories and organize and build a class consciousness that could lead to a revolution. So a little bit like Bernie Bros of today, but maybe more like just kind of race-blind socialists. And then there was this group that was committed to following the lead of what they called Third World revolutionaries and, of course, the vanguard of the revolution here in America, the Black Panther Party. So, okay, this clip happens. My mom is up on stage. She's up at the podium, and the Panthers have arrived to talk.
And it was complicated because things were said about women that were not cool. But, you know, things were said about the black struggle that was cool.
She has to decide what to do.
Whenever white people have a choice, you can't make that choice without thinking about how easy it is to not stand up for black people at a given moment. I never felt like I wasn't choosing women, but I felt that, you know, the essential American dilemma is white people standing up not just once, but consistently over time against the apparatus of black slavery. Yeah, that one's easy for me, in fact, and not that complicated.
Yeah, very her. Okay, not that complicated. So, last thing I'll say is I think the series ends up being, for me, really about generations. It's about how the underground impacted those of us who were born into it, what it cost us and our families, the consequences of the turn to violence. Again, those consequences were personal and political, what they did to families and friends and loved ones, what it did to the movement. So I talk in the show, I talked to Jamal's son, Jad, who's here tonight. I talked to my adopted brother, Chesa Boudin, who's, of course, Kathy Boudin and David Gilbert's son. I talked to Kakuya Shakur, who's the daughter of BLA icon Assata Shakur. And Assata, most of you know, is still underground all these years later, still paying the price for her activism in those days. So I talked to these kids, they're not kids, they're my age, but I talked to them about how it felt to be raised by parents who were also revolutionaries. People who had us as kids, even though they were at war with the US government. How we understood that, what we learned from it, how we internalized it. And I was trying to get at something, not just the kind of, you know, the personal question of what it does to us, but what that might mean for all of us who are inheriting that era. So I want to play one last clip. This is of our daughter, Light, who's here tonight. My wife, Rachel, and I, our daughter, Dalen, and Light are here, but this is Light arguing with my dad over dinner. So I was actually just an innocent bystander in this conversation. We were trying to figure out how to end the series. We'd already completed maybe 7 or 8 of 10 episodes, and I was starting to panic about how we were going to land this plane. And they started talking over dinner. And this is the kind of talk that happens fairly often in my family. It's a very strange family, but they started talking about exactly this, right? The question, the conflict between the personal and the political in revolution. So I had the good sense to secretly hit record on my iPhone and slide it into the middle of the dinner table. And this is what they were talking about. While I was working on this series, our 13-year-old daughter got into a debate with my dad over dinner. Our daughter had been studying John Brown at school, and she thought he seemed crazy for giving his life and the lives of his sons for a political idea. Keep in mind, my dad literally has a tattoo of John Brown on his back. For him, the radical abolitionists are heroes and role models, white people willing to risk everything in the fight against slavery.
I mean, I don't want to diminish his sacrifice, like, that's amazing, and he made a difference, but, like, come on, I mean, it's not really a rational thing to give up your family and then yourself.
Well, I mean, they were adults, but he did raise his sons to...
Nothing wrong with that.
Lamb to the slaughter type of deal?
Yeah. But the point is, when you say he was a fanatic, he was an extremist, that's true. And it's also true that the rational thing to do was just let slavery be. I mean, what are you going to do? That's crazy. To me, that's crazy. I'll be great.
What do you think?
I don't like it. It unsettles me to think about you or Bill caring about a political issue more than you care about me. I feel like it's like weird to think about a father who cares more about like sticking it to the man than his sons.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now so we can have our conversation. But I'll just say, for me, the show ultimately ends up being about this tricky question: how you balance the personal and political, what it means to have revolution as an inheritance, and just in a more general sense, what do we take from our parents and the generations that came before us? And I think it's a complicated legacy, not just for me as an individual, and not just for the other Weather Kids and Panther Cubs, but for our sons and daughters, and really for all of us. I think everybody in this room. I think we've all inherited, obviously, a world in need of transformation. And we've all inherited also this struggle that stretches back long before any of us was born. It's passed down to us. And I think revolution and struggle is in the DNA of this country. So I also think that means we inherit the mistakes and the failures of the past. We all have to reckon with the debts of the generations that came before us, in particular, systemic slavery, injustice, racism. But I also think it means we inherit that struggle. We inherit a commitment and a responsibility to continue to fight for a better world. And I think we inherit the responsibility to pass that struggle along. So that's what we tried to do. Thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to have a conversation.
So one of the things I realized when I just listened to the first clip, I didn't realize that when you asked Bernadine how she felt about you doing this, she said, "It scares me." And I had forgotten that. So I didn't even have that in my notes, but now I have it in my notes. So you want to talk about that a little? Like, what do you think?
Yeah.
Did she talk more about that?
She did, yeah. We talked about it a fair amount. I mean, those of you who know Bill and Bernadine can probably guess that when I told them I was thinking about doing this project, Bill was all in and thrilled and wanted to chat and wanted to say everything. And I literally had many times sitting in a room with the two of them, and he'd be eager to answer a question, and she would be like, "Shut up, stop talking, you're saying too much." And she's close to the vest, both, characterologically, and she, I think, has I think she believes ideologically in not saying too much. So she didn't want to get into certain things that she felt like she might not want to be able to talk about. There were still, Jamal and I have talked about this a lot, there were still are, but at the time still were many people in prison facing long prison sentences who had been in prison for a long time. Nobody wanted to jeopardize them or their struggles to get out. So I think it was that kind of reluctance. And I think over time she came to feel like we were being careful and weren't going to spill secrets that shouldn't be spilled, but that, she was nervous at first.
I was wondering if that being scared had to do with you, that she was afraid somehow of alienating you or losing your love, or...
I think there was part of it. I think she did say to me at one point, there are things that I don't want you to have to hear again or hear for the first time, and there are things that I'm worried about saying to you. But, I reassured her that there were, not only was there nothing she could say that would make me stop loving her, but also that...
You'd thought about it all quite a bit.
Yeah, that in fact, probably the things I've guessed or imagined were worse than what actually happened. So, she came around.
So let me just ask you one thing, and then I want to ask Jamal something. Just because we're in art school, you chose the form. You're a playwright. It could have been a play. It is a play in so many ways. The structure is so fascinating to me. It's so compelling. As a piece of work, it's so compelling. I think everyone who's listened to it feels that way. It just grabs you. So I think you used all your skill, I thought. So I want to hear how and when did you make the decision it would be a podcast, and why? And I also want you to talk about the idea of memoir, and why now in your life would you do this? Like what? And not just because of where your parents are in their life or where others who are involved in the struggle, but where you are.
Ooh, that's a lot of things. I think. Well, I'll start with the easy part. The podcast came about because I'd been writing I'd never written anything about my parents or about this time, and I think partly as a young writer, it was too close to I wanted material that was a little bit further away from me, and I'd never written nonfiction before either. But I started getting interested when I had kids and when I started thinking about my own childhood in a different way from that other lens. I started thinking maybe that's a story I should tell one day. And I'd written a TV pilot a few years ago that it wasn't the same as this show, but it was kind of dealing with some of the similar issues. And then a woman, Sarah Geismer, who I was working with on that pilot, called me and she said, I'm now the head of podcasting at Crooked Media. Would you ever want to do this as a podcast? And I didn't know what that meant, and I said no. And then they kind of, we had a long conversation about it. But I think it ended up, I mentioned the pandemic, I think it ended up being really essential form for what we were trying to do, to capture the voices and to let people, the audience or the listener actually kind of intimately into that period. Everybody involved in the show, Jamal, my dad, Kathy Wilkerson, Asada, so many of them have written their stories. And I thought this was a great form to preserve their voices in a different way and to let the audience really immerse in that time period. I think that, there's been great documentaries made, but there's something about seeing, the talking heads and the archival footage. It doesn't let you live through those moments. So, Ariana, Misha, Arwen, some of the people who knew podcasting and knew how to use audio, they kind of taught me along the way how to use it to tell a story that would really feel immediate in that way. And the playwriting, of course, like for me, storytelling, writing is what I think of myself as that. And I never even, when they first asked me to do it, I said, I'll write it, but you have to find somebody else to say it, because I definitely did not want to do that. I still feel very iffy about that.
There's something so powerful about the audio. And you're right, it's like reading where you can just go inside yourself and listen without visual distraction. Just turn into a deeper place, I think. So Jamal, we've talked so much, but can you want to set the stage for this period? And you were there. What was that like? What was it like? I mean, I know what it was like. I was there too, but a lot of people in the audience were not, or have a different version of it. But what was this period like for you? I mean, the war, the police violence, everything. How did and also, I'll throw the second part of this question to you too, because I know you can handle this, which is you talk about how all of this forged your creative self and that you're still really living with that energy. So can you weave all that together as the great storyteller you are?
Yeah, I'll try. But Carol, thank you for this evening, because, I remember talking to you when you had come off that trip and that cross-country trip and heard it and said right away, I'm going to bring Zayd to Columbia and we're going to have this great conversation. So thank you for this. Thank you, Gavin. Thanks for everybody that kind of made the evening happen. Please off script just for a second. This thing about the fear of what the state will do and how deeply entrenched we are in a fascist state, a police state, and a surveillance state rings so true. So with my own work, and Zayd and I had this conversation because I was afraid as well.
Afraid to do the podcast.
Well, not afraid because I knew it was in Zayd's hand, but we talked about every time something comes up, every time that there's a story that's done that's objective, that's favorable, what the reprisals are. And at that time, and there have been projects that I passed on or kind of reimagined, because I would say, I have friends who are still in prison. Mutulu Shakur, Sundiata, Akoli, David Gilbert, that might not get out if we tell the story. Thankfully, in those 3 years, they're home because there's been a resistance movement and a movement energized with hope and optimism that fought to bring them home. But every time something was done, and this was under the Obama administration, every time there was a story about Assata Shakur, Attorney General Holder raised her ransom, raised the reward money. from what was hundreds of thousands to now what is several $1 million. So we're talking about the way that the state functions. And we're talking about the way the state will try to appease other folks, even as you are pushing back against fascism, and sometimes not really clear, sometimes doing it by what we called, by any means necessary. And it's a clear and present concern and clear and present danger. My kids grew up with the knowledge of what it was. Joyce, my wife, who was here when the FBI arrested me, I think it was 1981, we were living downtown. Jamal Jr. tells stories of having an M16 pointed at his head before he was born. Joyce was pregnant with our oldest son. FBI agents threw her on the ground. She was partially clothed, guns to her head, guns at her stomach, and she had to scream, "I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant." So we're dealing with that kind of fascist police state mentality that was very present in those days and prevails to this day. So what it was like growing up as someone who was raised by adopted grandparents whose older siblings and parents were slaves, who heard about violence firsthand. They had family members who were lynched, friends who were lynched. They told me stories about the South where if you were black and a white person was coming down the street, that you had to get off the sidewalk. And if it was a black grandmother who was in her 70s or 80s and a healthy young white boy who was 12 years old coming down that street and it was raining, grandma was getting her shoes muddied that day. There was and many black households will remember this from the 50s and the 60s, there was Ebony magazine and Jet magazine that would be on the coffee table in the living room near the family Bible that had those pictures of Emmett Till after he was murdered, and his mother was brave enough to say that coffin needs to be opened because I want the world to see what was done to my son. So I was raised as a black boy with that cautionary tale. This is what happens when you whistle at a white woman. But the bigger message was, this is what happened if you don't remember that place, your place in America. If you don't step off the sidewalk, if you sass, if you do whatever, if you stand up. And seeing that violence constantly reinforced, even as we participated in the civil rights movement, seeing those images of people being attacked by German shepherds and by cattle prods, hearing those stories from the freedom riders that would come to the black churches in the North to get support and to recruit folks, and then the assassination of Dr. King. And by the way, growing up, in terms of police violence for black kids, we talked about, we had this conversation in the podcast about the Black Liberations Army response to state terror and to police violence. It was a rite of passage for us. So if you got stopped and smacked around by cops, that was considered what was going to happen. We had names for cops. That was Batman, that was Robin, that was Lurch. And if Lurch catch you, for sure you wouldn't get your butt beat. So there was an incident where we snuck into a basketball court for a park that was locked. And we got caught. And we were good kids. We were coming home from church. We were doing good in our local school. And the cops said, "What are you doing? You're trespassing. You're going to the youth house tonight." And then they took out their baton. We said, "No, this is our name. We're sorry." And at that time, the police still carried their batons and their nightsticks. And they whipped us across the legs and chased us out of the park like we were cattle. And we ran down the street and we were catching our breath. And this is something that's informative, but I'm also ashamed of. My friend Roger was crying. And I said, "You're crying?" And he says, "No, I'm not crying." And I said, "You're a punk, you're crying. Listen to the context. We had been assaulted. A felony had been committed by adults on children. An act of terror was committed by people who were being paid by our parents' tax dollars to protect us. And our response was, you couldn't take that like a man, you're crying." So what happened as the civil rights movement evolved to the Black Liberation Movement was that when we saw this terror at home and abroad, there were voices who emerged, like Malcolm X, like Stokely Carmichael, that said it is not only okay for us to talk about that and to identify ourselves in the way we want to be identified, not as Negroes, not as colored, but as Black, and to talk about Black power, that it is okay to resist, as Malcolm said, by any means necessary. So the civil rights movement, where a lot of people came out of into the Black Power movement and to the Black Liberation movement, and the anti-war movement, that a lot of people came out that said we can confront this peacefully, the state responded with more and more terror. The state didn't respond by saying, let's sit down and talk about what was going on. The state didn't say, let's stop by having a moratorium on violence, not only on foreign soil, but here in America. They responded with more terror. And so when we looked at the history of liberation struggles and what people had to do, not just to gain attention, but to survive. It's that lesson that you learn in school when you go, you know, my grandmother, who was a God-fearing Christian woman, but had also been a Garveyite, you know, it was one of those households where you were in church 3 or 4 times a week. If I got beat up by a bully, her response to that was not to pray for that bully. Her response was, you go back, you fight, even if you get your nose bloody, and we'll pray about all of that later. So that was kind of the context of what was happening in the Black community, but also was happening in America at that time, when we saw just increasing levels of terror at home and abroad. Remember the escalation in the Vietnam War. Vietnam continued to escalate in the face of the peace movement. So people were protesting and asking for peace, and then we were seeing images on the television of children running naked from fires that had been created by napalm, of American soldiers executing people. You know that famous thing where an American army officer just executes a guy right on national television. And so that's the frustration that you're seeing in terms of the peace movement, and that's the frustration that we're experiencing in the Black community, and that created fertile ground for what we call revolutionary resistance, not only for political ends, but to us, for mere survival.
Okay. Do you want to talk about what Zayd mentioned, and I think we were talking about earlier, is even those of us who were there at that time, or in the world at that time, and in the left at that time, had no idea about this relationship between the Weather Underground and the Panthers and the Liberation Army. We didn't know of that connection. I don't know why we didn't know that, but I would like you to talk about that a little bit, and, you know, because it was something that was new to me to understand that. It explained a lot, but it was also new to me.
Me first? Yeah. We were tight from those above what we call, for us, we distinguish it for my brothers and sisters and my comrades who are in the room. And I want to talk about that comrade word, because that's what it was to us. We were linked arm in arm, right? Beyond brothers and sisters. Yes, we called each other brothers and sisters because we were aware that this was a class struggle. What I learned that first day coming to the Panther office, when I first showed up with my friends who didn't quite know what the Panthers were, was that the Panthers were no joke, that you couldn't get out. It was going to be like the mafia, you know. Once you joined, you couldn't get out. And as we're riding, the Panther office in Harlem wasn't open yet, so we were taking the long train ride to Brooklyn. And I was like, can't get out. Damn, I got a 9 o'clock curfew. What am I tell grandmother? And then that we had to prove ourselves by killing a white dude, right? And I said, kill a white dude? I'm in the church choir. And my other friend said, no, you don't have to kill a white dude. I was so relieved. It was like, you got to kill a white cop, and you got to bring in his badge and his gun. And so you don't want to be a punk in front of your boys. So I went anyway. I realized now that they were trying to scare me so that if I ran, they could say, we were all going to go, but you know, to the Panther office, but you got scared. And in the meeting, which was a political education class, the person running the meeting was explaining the Panther 10-point program. And if you look at the 10-point program, which is now, I think, 55, 56 years old, it could have been written last week because it's talking about housing, it's talking about healthcare, education. Police brutality is actually point number 7. And I jump up and I say, choose me, brother, arm me, I'll kill a white dude right now. And that's when he calls me up and he reaches into the bottom drawer of this desk he was sitting in, and my heart is pumping in my skinny little chest. I was like, oh, he's gonna give me a big damn gun. And then he gives me a stack of books. But the lesson didn't end there. He stopped and said, this is my first day in the Brooklyn Panther office in the heart of the ghetto in Brooklyn in Bed-Stuy. He said, young brother, let me ask you a question since you came in here so mad at white folks. If all of these brutal cops, these pig police that are locking people up, beating people up, shooting people down, if all of them were black and all of the people being brutalized were white, if all of the landlords and the business owners that are selling us rotten food and spoiled vegetables at exorbitant prices and renting us these rat-infested, unheated apartments, if all of them were black and all of the tenants were white, and if everybody in the government was black and all the oppressed people was white, would that make things correct? And I thought for a second, I said, well, no, sir, no, brother, it seems like we'd still be wrong. He said, that's right, young brother. This is a class struggle for human rights, not just a race struggle for civil rights. So that idea of functioning above ground, that these were our class brothers and sisters and that we were fighting for the same things, made us brothers and sisters, and then as we went to arms, made us made us be comrades. So we were friends, so we were hanging out with folks from Rising Up Angry and from SDS and the Black Panther Party and Iwa Kun, based in Chinatown, which stands for the Harmonious Fist. We were selling papers together. We were at each other's events. We were crashing at each other's apartments, sharing the same food. And then when people started to go underground for various reasons, those friendships continued and those relationships continued as we picked up arms or whatever that was, And so we recognize that closeness. It's not strange to us to reflect in that way. So when you see us hugging each other, those were hugs that began on college campuses, at different protests, outside of prisons when we were rallying for people to be released, that existed and got more intense as people went underground. And a lot of that work was liberating certain people from prison. And a lot of that work is what we call, in the Black Liberation Army, armed propaganda. And it was, as I said in that segment, not just an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but be aware that in the same way there's a fascist force of terror in the community, there is a force of resistance in the community. And it's not just going to be an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but you continue to radicalize us and unify us each time that you murder us. And for us, that was true across communities. It was happening in black communities and brown communities and in poor white communities. In fact, and I'll be quiet after this, if you go online and you look at a segment, Bob Lee, who was a great organizer, and there's a segment, and a lot of people says it's the Panthers organizing hillbillies, but it's actually Panthers in West Chicago with working class white folks. And it's true, there were some Confederate flags on the wall. And one of the greatest moments is not just that the Panthers are there talking about solidarity and organizing around housing in the white community. Bob Lee, who was a Black Panther leader, is talking to this 12 or 13-year-old white kid who's so mad about police brutality that he's talking about getting a Molotov cocktail and throwing it at a police car. And a white woman had just talked about how badly the police brutalized her brother, and he's saying, we don't want you to do that because we don't want you to get killed. So that kind of organization and unity was pointing out not just what was happening in black community, but all oppressed communities where the police were occupying those communities like an occupying army to protect the interests of state capital.
Zayd, anything from all your research here?
Yeah, well, so I'll start with the personal because we've been talking about the personal and the political. For me, the reason it felt important to investigate this line in my family's history is, my name, Zayd, I was named after a Black Panther soldier, Zayd Malik Shakur. And my brother Malik was named after Zayd Malik Shakur and Malcolm X. And my brother Chesa was named after George Jackson, Chesa Jackson Gilbert Boudin. So, we had these names of Black revolutionaries. And I always knew that, but it gave me a little bit of credibility when I was going to public school in Harlem. But other than that, I didn't really think about it too much, But when we started to tell this story, I thought, okay, first of all, I was born with this Black revolutionary name. Second of all, my adopted brother Chesa, his parents were in prison for decades for an action committed with these Black Liberation Army people. How did that happen? I was kind of trying to start at the end and trace back and say, what made these two groups braid together in that way? What made them willing to do that? And so, yeah, Jamal, there's so many things, but, Fred Hampton was literally trying to put together what he called a rainbow coalition in Chicago when he was killed. So why was he the target? Well, there's something dangerous about that sort of organizing, right? And if you read the Weathermen communiques, which Ty and Ariana and I spent a lot of time doing, you realize half of them are about the Vietnam War and the other half are about Fred Hampton or Zayd Shakur or the Black Liberation Army. A lot of the actions, the famous ones are like bombing the Pentagon to protest the war, but they also bombed New York City police headquarters. Why? So we started digging into that, and most treatments of the Weather Underground treat it as a separate thing. They talk about anti-war white activists and then the Black Panthers as a separate thing. But if you dig into it for 1 second, you realize both sides seem to be making an effort to reach out to the other and say, like, we're on the same side, we're doing this work together. And I can't help but think that the reason that history has been passed down as separate is because of that danger. That if it were remembered as a moment when there was an intersectional revolutionary movement, that's a different kind of history than a Black movement and a white movement that were,
and just really quickly, in the above ground, we were working in each other's communities, right? So it wasn't just that people were just, meeting up at rallies. So around housing, around those medical centers, right, you had you had people from other communities working in those programs, and so around tuberculosis in Chinatown, or around an act of police brutality, or some kind of workers' rebellion in white communities, we were working in each other's communities literally. So that work began above ground.
So I want to open to questions soon, but I want to get to one thing that's important. And Jamal, you're famously recorded as having talked about burning down Columbia at one point, or thinking that was a really good idea. So I would like to just talk about how that energy moved into, how did that energy get transformed to building institutions after wanting to destroy institutions or blow them up?
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
That quote from a speech, really quickly, the whole part
it will
of that
live with you
is
forever as a professor at Columbia.
Yeah, no, it definitely will. But I was out on bail on the Panther 21 case. And so Afeni Shakur and I, for a long time, were the only two members of the Panther 21 that were out. And so we got sent around to speak at a lot of places as these people who were out on bail. And later it was Duruba Ben Wahad and Sechueo Tabor and Joan Bird. So I was speaking at Columbia. Again, Familia had, been up here for takeovers and crashed here and all that. And the students had taken over the campus. And what had happened recently was that white students had been killed at Kent State for protesting the war. And Black kids had been killed at Mississippi State. So the first part of that speech was America has shown, and this goes back to how do you get radicalized and you go from the peace movement to this. America has shown in Mississippi State, in the civil rights movement in Mississippi State, that they will kill any nigger who stands up. And what they have shown you, brothers and sisters, in Kent State is that to them, anybody who stands up is a nigger. So that at Columbia University is one of those institutions, well, then you should burn the damn place down. So that's the other part. But it was really in prison when I started two theater companies. Started a theater company when some other prisoners had known that I had been involved in the Black Arts Movement, because there was a vibrant Black Arts movement that, of course, the Last Poets were part of, Sonia Sanchez, Amiri Baraka. And so I'd done a few plays and I'd done a little poetry. And I literally got to Leavenworth, was minding my own business, and I got surrounded by, a bunch of older Black prisoners. And it was like, yo, you was in the Panthers outside? And I was like, yeah. It was like, uh-huh. It was like, you did karate and stuff when you was out there? And that was like, a little, I was a young black belt, but that was a little less known. How did they know that? I was like, yeah. It was like, yeah, you did the plays and shit on the outside? And I was like, yeah. And it was like, yeah, okay, do something for Black History Month. And I went to the library, and there was only one Black play in the library. It was A Raisin in the Sun. And there was Romeo and Juliet, Raisin in the Sun. That was the extent of the theater, the extent of the theater kind of collection. So I came back and I said, guys, I can't really do this because the only Black play is A Raisin in the Sun. And it's really about, a Black matriarch trying to take care of her family. And without a beat, I'm not making this up, say, Mr. Cody, who was the older guy, like the Godfather, he was like, it's okay, young blood. Just look out on the yard, pick out 3 or 4 dudes, we put a dress on them. So I went back and wrote a play. And then white prisoners came, Latino prisoners came. First it was the Mexican Mafia. And we're rehearsing, and some of the Mexican Mafia guys, very dangerous crew, and they come in, David, and they just sit down, and they're like kind of just checking out the rehearsal, and they left their section of the prison. They usually don't do that unless they have beef and they came to kill somebody. And then Raphael, who was one of the leaders, after about 15 minutes, he was like, yo, Essay, let me talk to you. And I was like, oh shit, it's me, what's the beef? I just got here. And he pulls me to the side. He says, my brother, I want you to listen to me real good. I've been sitting here, I've been checking you out, Holmes. And that guy you're working with, that effing guy, yo, Holmes, he's not really feeling his character. He actually did Shakespeare in high school. So I said, well, why don't you get in? And they were good. And so I kind of, rewrote it. And so now it was the Black and Brown Black History Month play. And then a brother who used to be in the Aryan Brotherhood came. And so he came up and hung out. He came back down to his crew. His name was Reb, Big Rebel, right? He was 6'2". He was a black belt.
Jamal, is this real?
This is real. And everybody surrounds him, and they go, it's the bikers, it's the Aryan Brotherhood. And they go, Reb, you was up there with them blacks and the Latinos? And he said, yup. And they said, well, what are they doing? Because they thought it was some kind of takeover, an escape plot. He said, well, they're doing a play. And he said, well, Reb, what did you do about it? Because Reb really could knock you out with one punch and one kick. He said, well, they give me a part. We had our own courtyard rehearsing the play. And we pulled this off. And it occurred to me that the work could continue. This work of class struggle, this work of unity through the theater arts. And so that became something that we used to create a forum where people talk, to create a council. And then I realized the power of revolution and institution building. And so when I came out, and Joyce would always visit and write me and send me plays and encourage me to write, and I realized the power of arts and education to continue the movement work. And that was the beginning of it, and how I moved to arts and education.
Yeah. Can I say one quick thing about that?
You can say more than one thing.
Yeah, no, I really love that Jamal said that, and I think I mentioned earlier that, I became a writer and not an activist, but of course it's more complicated than that, and that relationship between art and activism, between how, and we're here at the School of the Arts, it's worth talking about the way that storytelling does and can change the world. And I was thinking about, my wife Rachel is teaching at Stateville Penitentiary in Chicago right now, and these are guys who are locked up for, in some cases, forever, and are wanting to learn how to be poets and essayists and memoirists and novelists. And you realize that there is a liberatory sort of resistance quality to arts education and to the arts. And it killed me when we were working on the show, first to meet Jamal and find out he was a playwright and a screenwriter just like me, and that he taught in a playwriting and screenwriting program just like me. And then we interviewed Jihad Abdulmumin, who's also a BLA guy, lower level guy, but not connected to Jamal in the sense of like personal education, but he's off being a playwright now. And Kathy Boudin was a poet. And so many of these revolutionaries had this kind of split life of activism, trying to change the world, and then even at that time, writing, performing, making art. But certainly once the kind of active militant phase of the revolution waned, a lot of them turned their attention to the arts and to education. And I think that's sort of a key insight from talking to them.
I think that's an important point, because after the women's movement was quieter, the Vietnam War ended, a lot of the people who had been activists on all fronts built other things. They went into the labor movement. They went into the healthcare movement. They took that energy and that enormous optimism. And I think that's a really important thing of that period, that there was just this energy, and the energy was to change the world. And then when it stopped being one way, that maybe people could change the world, and people went another way. And I think that's why you didn't burn Columbia down ultimately, and ended up being a professor and building the film program, and really influencing generations with impact. Also, impact repertory theater, which if people haven't seen, is an extraordinary accomplishment on so many fronts. I know we need to stop now because we need to open it to questions. Let's do that. So we're here, and they're here. Jennifer.
Well, thank you.
Wait, you're going to get a mic from somebody. Yeah. Unless you don't want a mic.
It's okay. I can take a mic.
It's better for,
yeah. I know you're Zoom.
Just in general.
Yeah. Hello.
Hey, Jennifer. Comrade sister.
So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm pretty intimately connected to this, and that's my sister Bernadine and my nephew. And my role was very different because I was the above ground voice, and my sister and I were organized through very different means. That I came through was organized by the Black movement and not the student movement, and that had a different impact. So I'm just going to push back a little, because I think the solidarity is real important, and I think the price that Black people have paid historically and continue this day, you can't make them equal to what's happened to white people. And it's complex, and there's class, and there's people who have always stood up, but I don't think that I want to push back. I think Black people certainly paid a price way beyond what we have done. So I want to just push a little bit about the necessity to do this, and also say be constantly aware that as white people the reason we survived, and I could put my son on planes and be one day running with Lumumba Shakur, and the next day be underground with my sister under a tree on a commune, and dress my oldest Amilcar as a girl on a plane, and we had a different privilege that comes with this, and we should always be aware of it as we build this.
Yeah. No, I agree. I don't think it's pushing back. We talk, in the show, one of the things we were very aware of is certainly the greater price paid in so many cases by Black militants from that time, the much different ability of white revolutionaries to reintegrate to society. And one of the interesting moments for me is when we were trying to figure out how to introduce the story of Assata Shakur and the traffic stop that led to her, to Zayd Shakur's killing, and Assata, ultimately being arrested and then broken out of prison and still living underground today. That traffic stop we introduced by talking about a time when my mom was pulled over by the police while she was on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. And, imagine being pulled over, you're literally a most wanted fugitive. The cops pull you over for like a tail light or something, and he came up and she was apparently shaking. She tells this story in the show. She was shaking, and this white cop with his aviator glasses put his hand over her hand on the steering wheel and said, "You don't have to be afraid of us. We're on your side." And he let her go. I mean, I kind of love that story because imagine being the cop who let Bernardine Dohrn go. But it also just does show that when Asada got pulled over, there was no, like, we're on your side. So of course, yeah, the price that people paid was different. On the other hand, there are white revolutionaries who did decades in prison, and there were white revolutionaries who gave their lives for what they were doing. So that's real too.
Yeah, absolutely just agree. But while you were talking, can we just, as we're talking about ancestral spirit and revolutionary spirit, can we just take a moment and show love to one of our great revolutionaries, Yuri Kuchiyama, and all of the work that she did to bring all movements together. So I just, please do your research on Yuri Kuchiyama, and we're trying to do some stuff to honor her creatively in that creative space too, in terms of all of the work that she did. The only Asian who was part of Malcolm X's organization for African American Unity. There's photos of Yuri moments after Malcolm got shot, as people were running, and some of them had been trained in the FOI, had trained security people, and when the gunshots ran out, Yuri, who I think was maybe 5 feet tall, less than 5 feet, ran toward the stage. And you can Google it and see that Yuri is cradling Malcolm's head, is how much she loved Malcolm and Malcolm loved her. But when you talk somebody that was there fighting for political prisoners and prisoners of war, tirelessly, bringing communities together, representing this solidarity that you talk about, she's someone that everyone should do some research on, Yuri Kuchiyama.
We have someone here, yeah, and someone right there. Maybe you can give a mic to the next person so we can move it after. So you first.
Okay. First of all, just thank you all so much. I really, really, really enjoyed this, just everything about this, and just how you, Professor Joseph, you just mentioned Yuri Kochiyama. I feel like, I don't know, it's rare that I hear her name talked about, and I think that's very reflective of just like our education and everything. And I guess this kind of connects to my question as well, because as you all mentioned, like the very important role that the arts has towards like facilitating consciousness and like increasing people's education about history and about the present. So I guess just like how do you think the arts can be, I guess, like utilized more or like made more accessible to different communities across the country, and also like, I guess like just how can it be more connected with like education and making sure young people especially understand these histories that are so important.
See?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways, but I would say, and I'm sure Jamal has seen this too, my students I run an MFA program for playwriting and screenwriting, and so I meet a lot of young artists and a lot of artists who are, just beginning their careers, beginning to think about their own artistry, their own craft. And I would say that there's been a pretty decisive sea change in the last 3 to 5 years of people really seeing their work, almost all of them now, seeing their work as being connected to making change in the world. So, I mean, I don't have a great answer except to say I think this generation of young people right now, young artists, are all building those communities and building structures to, make that kind of change. And I think they're everywhere. The kind of, where I live in Chicago, every young theater group is kind of building a small, community in miniature of like how they can take care of each other, how they can make change in the world, how they can make art together. And it's, exciting, that part of it.
It's also it's really been important in art schools to take seriously the issue of diversity and who's coming to school, and making sure that so many stories are being told, and that we're helping those stories be told by giving people access to the form and learning how to be professionals and professional storytellers. So they go out in the world and they make podcasts and they make film and they make plays and they because that's the next generation. And I really agree with Zayd, and I know Jamal agrees too. I mean, we're just seeing these amazing stories and plays coming out of this school and every other art school and every other art department. So it's happening, you know, it's happening. It's no longer the domain of one race or one gender or one. That's not what's going on anymore.
Well,
so we've gotten to live to see that, which is great.
Well, yeah, and Carol, I have to say, and under your leadership and your comradeship, we've seen that shift in the School of the Arts, where I'm teaching classes now, and this is, you know, I was the only black professor, the only professor of color when I first started teaching in the graduate film program 24 years ago. The faculty is now diverse, and my classes looks like the world that I want to be a part of. And we empower those voices for people to tell their stories, not the Hollywood way, but give them the stories, because the other thing is that we teach as professors, our job is to teach. It's not just good because you tell the story. So here are the creative tools to tell your stories in that way. But the other part of it is to empower young people to know that those stories are okay. And so the other part of my work with Impact Repertory Theater that Rosa Rivers and Joyce and I founded is that all of the stories that come out of that are young people's stories. And so that they are talking about identity and dreams and brutality, but also kind of celebrations of life. And if you think about what the creative arts have done, one of the reasons why is, you know, and I don't know if we were going to get to this question or not, would we do things the same way again today?
Let's make sure we get to that question before we leave. Okay.
Yeah. And the answer is no, for a lot of different reasons, because of what we learn and the prices that we pay. And as much energy and fearlessness that we had in anger, there was a lot of naivete about what the state did. We didn't know that this thing called the counterintelligence program existed, COINTELPRO. When I finally got my FBI files when I was in prison under the Counterintelligence Act, I actually shed tears realizing I didn't, even though we said that this government was wrong and evil and authoritarian and fascist, just how vicious they were. So for those reasons. But here's the other reason that's really important, right? A lot of people didn't know these stories, just what we're talking about, because there weren't enough eyes on it and enough ears on it. Now everybody has a mini studio in their pocket. And I remember Bobby Seale saying, Bobby Seale, who's co-founder of the Black Panther Party, Joyce, you remember this, we were all in Berlin. I think it was about 20 years ago. 25 years ago, Bobby said, when we started the Black Panther Party, Huey and I, we carried shotguns and law books because those were the progressive weapons of change. The shotguns were legal, the law books were to read people their rights. He said, if I was starting the Black Panther Party today, we'd still be on the street patrolling, but everybody would have a laptop and a camera. Guess what? They have. And now more eyes are on it. And so we can do radical organizing, right, and really effective consciousness raising by using the arts, by having young filmmakers who are out there daring to shoot, to edit these stories and giving us a constant pulse about what's going on. The next steps are for people to teach about grassroots organizing, to teach about those community programs, by the way, because it wasn't just about the marches and the rallies. People saw Panthers and Young Lords in their community every day serving the people. The breakfast programs, which has become the model of all free food programs that we have, were some young Panthers who said, let's feed these kids. And with no money and no permission, two important things. We didn't write a grant, we didn't wait for it. We went, we got people to give us some spaces, and for those vendors in the community that would and could, we got food, and within 2 days you'd have a breakfast program. And at the height, we were feeding 50,000 kids nationally. So though that kind of organization around people's needs is important, I think a lesson that we want to pass on when we talk about freedom, justice, and equality, freedom to someone who's having a hard time, who's dealing with food insecurity, who's hungry, is a meal, brothers and sisters, right? Justice for someone that is unhoused is a warm, safe, dry place to sleep, right? liberation for someone who can't get decent medical care is compassionate care. And again, Jennifer, you remember those free clinics that we started, where people could come, where doctors and nurses would volunteer their time and what we call liberate medicine, and turn a Panther office or a community center or a street corner into a place where people could get treatment. So there's those lessons that we want to pass along as well, you know, because a lot of times we would say, okay, that's all well and good, but that's abstract. What are we doing for people not only who are getting brutalized, but who can't get through the day because they can't eat, have no place to stay, and they can't get medical care?
So I want to say one thing, just because you brought it up, which has to do with institutions and changing institutions. You know, if you came out of these traditions and you ended up in institutions, and if you ended up in a position of authority in these institutions, then you felt obliged, because of everything that you'd come from, to subvert the institution. And that is where change occurs. Like when you get in a position where you actually can make change, and you use that position to subvert the values that are holding back diversity in the art school. You know, why do we have to fight for something like that? But yet we did, and we have, and we've made a big difference in, as a collective, and able to do that. But if you're not using your positions in those ways, then you're not being subversive in a positive way, which I still really believe is possible within institutional structures. So I just wanted to throw that in. Okay, so you've been holding the microphone for way too long.
Okay, I'm listening.
We all go on too much. Okay.
I was struck by the part, I think you were asking your mom in the podcast about some of the psychological underpinnings of what led her into this work. And she just dismissed it and said that was really just a bourgeois, you know. Fair enough. But we as children want to understand our parents, and we as parents want to think about, you know, to your question that your kids asked. And I'm asking you this because I'm wondering the same thing. How do we honor and carry forward this struggle, while also trying to understand a little differently some of the things that were asked of us, or more specifically you, and how do we carry that forward into what we decide to pass on to the next generation, and what to do differently?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think the first thing I would say is, yeah, my mom, I mean, to me, it's always been funny. She does not like to be analyzed herself. She does not like, you know, for her, these decisions are made from a political point of view. They're ideological. They're about what's right and what's wrong. For me, I couldn't help but look at her decisions and say, well, what drove you to that? What put you in that position? You know, and I think the moment you're talking about, I'm asking her about marching with Dr. King in Gage Park in Chicago and walking by all these, you know, working class white people who were screaming and throwing things, and somebody threw a brick and knocked Dr. King down, right? So this display of white working class racism. And, you know, her father, my grandfather Barney, was a white working class racist. I mean, he was a lovely guy in a lot of ways, and he had this kind of racial, you know, he grew up Jewish in a neighborhood where Jewish kids and black kids were competing over, you know, scraps, and he never lost that. So for me, that was just interesting to think, like, how did a young woman push back against her own parents and think about what she had to do? And in a way, I felt like I was reenacting that feeling, you know, what she took from her parents, what she rejected from her parents. For me, the show and this process was about trying to understand better so that I could decide which parts of the legacy I wanted to choose and which parts I didn't want to choose, right? And I think for me, for Jad, for Kikuya, for Chesa, one of the things that was so interesting to talk, for me, finally to connect, I mean, of course, I grew up with Chesa, but it's not like we sat down and talked about our parents a lot. That's not what brothers do, really. But for this series, to be able to talk to him and say, you know, what do you think they did right? What do you think they did wrong? What parts of their legacy are you claiming, and what parts are you not claiming? And for Kikuya, too, you know, she speaks so eloquently on the series about kind of, you know, losing her mother. In her case, kind of permanently. She hasn't seen her in 20 years, and her children have never met Asada. So that leaves scars, you know, and kids suffer from that kind of experience. And yet, I think every one of us, me, Ty, Jad's an organizer, Ty's a historian, I'm an artist, Kikuya's a poet and social worker, we're all choosing parts of the legacy that we think are important, that we think we can carry forward, right? So yeah, for me, it's about untangling a little bit of that and saying, would I do I mean, Jamal says it better than anybody, right? Like, would we do it the same way? Well, no, we would be smarter. We would be better. We would do it better. And it's not like I've done it better than my parents, but the hope is that each generation can wrestle with it, and each generation can pass on to the next generation what they've learned, you know? And I said at the beginning, to me, it's about, you can choose your legacy. It's not like you have to be born into the revolution to become a revolutionary. These guys chose that path, right? And so you could also be born into the underground and choose to be an artist, and you can be born to an artist and choose to do whatever these guys are going to do, And I think that's important too.
A quick funny story though, because it's amazing what kids understand and what they know. So this is a funny story about when Jad and our daughter Janai, who's a Columbia alum and works in marketing and advertising, I was picking them up from school. I think Janai was in kindergarten, bringing them from CPE. And we're driving up Madison Avenue. So I think Jad is about 6 and Janai is maybe 4. And the lights are starting to turn red. So I'm slowing down. And for some reason, my daughter wanted to get home. And she said, "Daddy, speed up." And then Jad, who was 5.5 or 6, says, "He can't speed up, Janai, because if he runs a red light, the cops will come. And when the cops come for him, he's going to jail because he was a Black Panther. And then Mommy's going to have to come get us all out of jail, and you'll still be late."
That's a great story.
It's great. But a kindergarten story, but why it's important to tell these stories. Joyce and I spoke to a group of kindergarten, pre-K and kindergarten class at CPE. And it was Black History Month. And so we were trying to figure out how to explain about the Panthers and, all that Joyce has done as an actress and the first Black model on the cover of 17 magazine and all the groundbreaking stuff. And then the teacher said, "And what do we know about the Panthers? What did we do?" And this was a multicultural group of students. And a 4-year-old little boy, a white kid, named Zachary, I remember Zach's name and face, raised his hand first and says, "We have breakfast because of them. We have a breakfast program." I wanted to take Zach home and just say, here is my white grandson. You guys won't make me a grandfather. My wife and I have offered cash incentives for a grandkid. But it's so important, everyone, to tell these stories. Listen to what I'm saying. It is so important to tell these stories and to do it in the spirit that has been in indigenous circles since mankind began. And, in Africa, we talk about the griot that told these stories. You never know when they're going to take root, but they will take root. And so it's important for us not to let the stories die and to make them human and to make them accessible so that whoever we are talking to, especially our young people, feel access and connection to the story. That's what keeps the humanity alive and keeps the struggle for justice and freedom and equality alive.
Okay. And we have 1 minute. There's only one criticism that I've actually read of the podcast. Everybody loves it. But the criticism by a historian that I read was that it's light on taking up the issue of violence. That you don't actually, in the podcast, explore violent acts that might have happened, were planned to happen, but didn't happen. And that perhaps there is a legacy in the building of mass movements like the civil rights movement that might have been more effective into the future. So I don't know if either of you want to take that up. This is not coming from me, but I read an article that was talking about it. I thought, okay, let's throw that out there. What do you think in talking about the future?
I'm glad to take that on because we set context for what was going on and how violent, H. Rap Brown, Iman Jamil, I remember hearing a speech that he gave when I was 14 years old, and he would always talk about how violence is as American as cherry pie. right? And the original name of the Black Panther Party was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. There are great organizations that existed that understood self-defense in the black community. There was the Black Panther Party of Lowndes County, Alabama, right? Of people who were civil rights people that understood that they needed to carry the guns because the Klan was murdering people. There was an organization called the Deacons for Defense. These were all men and women who were ministers, who were deacons in the church, that understood that they had to arm themselves for the purpose of self-defense. So I will say, and I think other people who were veterans of the Black Liberation Army will say, lives were saved because people dared to show the state that we will defend ourselves, that there will be acts to do it. Do we live in a time where that violence still exists? Yes, but we have a different way of retaliating now, of doing that, and I mentioned that earlier, because of the mass movement that's created by our ability to capture these images and to get people out on the street. So I don't shy away from saying it existed in this context and that I do believe that lives were saved, but I also, when I talk publicly and when I talk to movement folks, just as with any struggle, the same tactics that you used 50 years ago or even 5 years ago do not necessarily apply in terms of what we're going on. So I don't think we it's not about sugarcoating, but when people says, oh, I regret that part of it so much, I, as a member of that community where the rampant murders were happening, Jennifer, just to talk about that, don't say to, and to some of my white comrades that may have planted some bombs that helped break some people out of jail, that literally saved some lives. It literally would give pause to the forces of oppression that were coming in, as they still do, as they murdered Breonna Taylor in her sleep, as black police. And boy, we had a slogan in the Black Panther Party that a pig was a pig was a pig. So what happened to Tyree Nichols is not a shock to people who are veterans of the movement, because we're dealing with institutionalized terror, institutionalized racism, institutionalized neo-colonialism, that if you endorse the state and understand that policing came out of the slave patrols that saw black people as property. And then this is why it's less true today, but certainly true a few years ago, why your grandmother could say somebody is kicking in my window about to come into my apartment, 911, and the cops will come a half hour later, if at all. But a white storekeeper on 125th Street could say, there's a black dude down the street looking like he's thinking about robbing my store, and they would be there before they can hang the phone up, because they were there to protect the state and to protect property. So let's be clear about that. And let's also be clear that we have rednecks, racists, and militia who are armed to the teeth, who are playing for a race war, right? So as we are examining that, and as we can do it from our positions, and those of us who are still alive, who have been able to go into medicine and social work and into the academy, that it is still some life and death struggle going on, and that then, as of now, people were being murdered, and there were people in the black community and white comrades who dared to push back, and sometimes that required violence.
Zayd, you have to have the last word.
I mean,
you get the last word.
I can't follow that, but I would say that, yeah, I think, common criticism of the Weather Underground my whole life was the Weather Underground came along, split the peace movement. The peace movement was going great, and then they came and there was violence, and then the peace movement fell apart, and so they didn't help end the Vietnam War. But, again, let's be clear. The peace movement had been fighting the Vietnam War for a very long time. These same activists had been protesting and marching and registering people to vote. And then the war went on. It escalated. Thousands of people were being murdered in their names. Likewise with violence against the black community. Fred Hampton was trying to organize a coalition. The police murdered him. So I think it's simple to say, oh, we should never use violence. We can just do this peacefully. We can all kind of move forward in a way that doesn't have any moral complexity. Well, that's also what the people, who are in power want, right? I mean, there's no, you think about Nat Turner or Toussaint Louverture or John Brown, there are times when violence becomes necessary to resist oppression. Not all the time, and I agree with Jamal that, you wouldn't want to just take the tactics and say we can apply those to any time and any place. But I think I can understand why activists felt like they had to do more. And in particular, I can understand why white activists felt like they had to be willing to risk more and sacrifice more when black people were being killed who were their friends and comrades, and that they had to put themselves on the line, put their bodies on the line to make that change.
Zayd, thank you for the podcast. Thank you for all the work. Jamal, thank you for everything.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for being a great audience. Thank you.